Even if you don't think rights are terribly important, and there are some religious and moral traditions that don't, nevertheless, we have to think about what kinds of beings have rights, and do all beings that have rights have equal rights? And for me, the most basic element is sentience.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'll be discussing the topic of abortion with a philosopher who has studied the moral arguments on both sides of the issue. I'm interested in rational bases of moral decision-making, and I'd like to be able to work out moral rules from a set of socially acceptable first principles. And I'd like to say, okay, then is morality acceptable in this case and not in this case? But when I try to do this, I often come up with points where my derived morality does not align with what society and even myself feel is actually morally acceptable. So does this mean that our socially acceptable morality is wrong, or that morality is not derivable from precepts? Or do I just have too simple of a set of moral precepts? I'd like to understand how a rational morality can be applied to the topic of abortion. So I hope you enjoy this interview. If you enjoy what you're hearing, I urge you to press like on your podcast app. And please come chat with me on my Facebook group, The Rational View. Give me your opinion. Bonnie Steinbock is Professor Emerita of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Albany, State University of New York. A fellow of the Hastings Center, she has been a visiting professor at Santa Clara University, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. In addition to 70 articles, she is the author of Life Before Birth, The Moral and Legal Status of Embryos, and the editor or co-editor of several collections, including Killing and Let Die, New Ethics for the Public Health Ethics, Theory, Policy, and Practice, the Oxford Handbook of Bioethics, and Ethical Issues in Modern Medicine, 4th to 8th editions. Her latest book, co-written with Paul Menzel, is Bioethics, What Everyone Needs to Know. Dr. Steinbock, welcome to The Rational View.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you coming to chat with us today about ethics and abortion. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background? Why did you get interested in philosophy?
Why I got interested in philosophy? Well, I always liked talking about ideas. And when I went off to college, I thought that that's what I'd probably be an English major, and that we would be talking about the ideas. And what a shock it was to find out they wanted to talk about style. So I loved my first philosophy course at Tufts University with Hilda Hine. And my first philosophy professor was a woman. It never occurred to me that philosophy was not for women because of my experience. Mm-hmm. And in the beginning, the first 2 years, it was equally men and women in classes. And in my junior year, by this time I was a philosophy major, I'm looking around, where'd all the girls go? It was all boys. But then I went to graduate school in philosophy, largely because I didn't know what I wanted to do after I graduated from college. And I had met Bert Dreyfus, who taught at MIT, and I was able to take classes with him over there. And when he went to Berkeley, I followed him and I went to Berkeley. He did continental philosophy. And so I started out Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Husserl. And at a certain point in my graduate career, I thought, maybe it isn't that I'm just a little slow. Maybe Heidegger is really impenetrable and doesn't make any sense. So I moved from continental philosophy into ethics. Continental philosophy has never been really great at doing ethics.
Okay.
And I started doing ethics. Now, this was I was in graduate school between 68 and 74. And bioethics was just in its very beginnings. And certainly nobody was teaching it at major universities. But students were also, because of the war and the civil rights movement and the women's movement, starting to ask for courses that were more relevant. And so I got interested in applied ethics. My first teaching job was at a small college in the Midwest, College of Worcester. And I thought that it would be interesting to examine, I had done ethical theory, the distinction between two very different approaches to ethics. Utilitarianism, which looks at consequences and tries to promote the best consequences, however those are defined. And Kantian ethics, which looks more at what is the nature of the action and is this something permissible, consistent with moral duty.
Interesting.
So I decided to take the example of killing and letting die, because from a utilitarian perspective, it doesn't really matter whether you kill someone or let them die. The outcome is the same. From a Kantian perspective, it makes an enormous difference. One is a kind of an action that may be permissible depending on the circumstances, other much fewer circumstances. So I edited this collection called Killing and Letting Die, and it went out of print in about 9 months. But after it went out of print, people started talking about it. And people assumed that because I had done this collection, which had articles on euthanasia and abortion in it, that I knew something about bioethics. So I figured perhaps I ought to learn something about bioethics. Backed into it. That's how I got into bioethics. And pretty soon in my career, I was asked to join a working group at the Hastings Center. So I did that.
I'm very interested, coming from the rational view, I'm very interested in rational bases for morality or rules-based theories of morality. So this is, kind of why I got into this, and to see, are we making mistakes with our socially accepted philosophy, or why is it that when I start from these basic rules, I always come to a point where this doesn't feel right morally? So that's kind of the basis of my interest in this, and to understand, how I feel morally, I assume is from my upbringing and from society's viewpoints that I've been inculcated through education and through observing. And then if I try to put together maybe a utilitarian moral philosophy, or let's say I assume sapient beings have rights and should be therefore respected, but then I get to the point, well, a baby isn't sapient necessarily, and it's obvious that a baby has rights.
Well, it depends on what you mean by sapient. They're certainly sentient. They can experience pain and pleasure. And that is the basis for the theory of my book, Life Before Birth. I'm not really much of a theory gal, and I'll tell you why not. Because it seems to me that morality is sufficiently complex that to hope that one theory is going to capture everything seems to me too optimistic, maybe even naive. And I can't think of a theory that doesn't run into problems. So I'm more of every different approach to ethics, whether it's utilitarianism, whether it's deontological Kantian, whether it's virtue ethics, captures something about the nature of morality. Why not allow all of them to be part of an ethical analysis? Intuition, I think, plays something of a role. The great philosopher John Rawls had this idea that what you could do was, if you came to something that just seemed wrong, then maybe you have to go back and tinker with your theory a little bit. He called this reflective equilibrium. So I don't give up intuition, but I don't think intuition by itself, it has to be supported by arguments. And I'd also question your view that your intuitions are solely dependent on upbringing, because people reject the views. You might have grown up in a family that was very conservative religiously and thought that people who are gay are disordered and it's a mental illness. And you might decide, is that really true? So I think what we do is we start with a background, and then we test things by our own experience and by reflection.
Interesting. So I do want to get into the field of abortion ethics, and maybe to set the frame. Could you explain the basis of the religious conservative argument against abortion and how that sits ethically?
Well, there is a religious argument that would probably have something to do with souls. But what I thought was interesting when I was writing my book, Life Before Birth, about the Catholic position, and by the way, let me just interject. I had students say, why do you always talk about Catholicism? I said, because they write things down, because they have one view. Protestants are all over the map, right? Jews, you get two people, three positions. It's easy to understand what the Catholic view is. And the interesting thing about the papal encyclical about abortion was that it was based not on religious principles, but rather on what they called genetic science. We now know that a new human being is created, they said, at conception, when the egg and the sperm are united. And now you have a being that it is neither the mother nor the father. It has its own genetic code. So therefore, this is the most logical point to say is the beginning of a new human being. All of the other things that happen, if it gets implanted and it begins to grow and it gets a heartbeat and it gets brain waves, and at some point in pregnancy, probably sometime after 17 weeks, certainly before 24 weeks, you get a being that can experience pain, is sentient. But according to this view, all of those things are simply developmental results from the initial beginning of a human being. And therefore, there is no logical point at which you can say, now we have a human being, whether at viability, when it can survive independently of the mother, or at sentience, when it can feel, or at heartbeat, or any of those things, because you've always had this particular individual right from the start.
That's very interesting, that it's not based on the soul, or it's not based on some religious dogma about when the soul is attached to the body. It's a scientifically based thing.
At least what I think when people miss the conservative argument as simply people trying to impose their religious views on you, I want to point out, well, actually, there's a non-religious version of this argument, which I think we do have to respond to and take account of.
So, any idea why they felt the genetic code was the most important thing about a human?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think because although it's not the only thing that affects what you're like, it's certainly very important, and it is unique to every individual. So it seems to be the thing that is kind of the basis. Right. I don't accept that, though. I think that the genetic code is very, very important. But for me, the question of abortion raises a more fundamental question in moral philosophy, and that is, what makes someone count morally? You could put it in terms of rights. You could say, what is necessary for a being to be a rights bearer, right? But I prefer to talk about it more broadly, because even if you don't think rights are terribly important, and there are some religious and moral traditions that don't, nevertheless, we have to think about what kinds of beings have rights, and do all beings that have rights have equal rights? And for me, the most basic element is sentience. And the reason for that is because if you have something that is non-sentient, the most obvious example would be a rock, a book, a car. Things can be done to protect it, to make sure it doesn't get destroyed, right? It can have value, but that value is always to value-bearing individuals, most normally human beings, right, who care about it. It can't have a sake of its own. You can't say, well, even if you don't like the painting, you should clean it for its sake. You can say that about a dog, for example. You can say, you should get that dog vaccinated, even if it's expensive, for its sake, to protect it, because we recognize that sentient beings have interests of their own. So it's this notion tying interest to sentience, and both of them to having moral status. Now, if that's the way you look at it, then the beginning of the biological organism is not the deciding factor, but rather when you have a being that has a sake of its own. Now, I'm not saying that we don't care about pre-sentient fetuses. If you're pregnant and you want a child, of course you do. You want to do everything you can to make sure that there is a live-born, healthy baby. It's not for the sake of the fetus, but because you have a stake in this becoming a baby. Nobody ever says, I'm painting my fetus's nursery. It's what you're focusing on, the born baby that will be. And it has that kind. So what does that mean? That means that there may be some things that we shouldn't do, for example, because it could cause pain to the fetus. For example, late gestation abortion, when that's necessary. It might be something that you would want to think about there. But everything else that you do for it is not done for the sake of the fetus itself, but for the sake of the born child. So don't drink during pregnancy. Don't smoke during pregnancy. Don't use drugs during pregnancy, because you increase the risk that the child will be have a disability if you do that, or even will not make it.
One thing I've heard a lot of the anti-abortion people saying is, it's wrong to kill innocent humans, and the fetus is a human. It's got its genetic code. It's human.
Right.
I hear this argument a lot, but I don't think it's a rational moral argument, because, just because it's a human, as you say, it doesn't have any rights just because it has a genetic code. There's, lots of things that have genetic codes that aren't human. And even if they are human, it's not necessarily given the rights of a human. And cancers have genetic codes of humans as well, and they don't have the same rights as humans.
That's a very good point to make. And here's another point that was made many years ago by the philosopher Marianne Warren. She said we should really distinguish between human in the biological sense, it has the DNA of a human, and clearly human fetuses are fetus. They're not dolphins, they're not cats, they're humans. And the moral sense of human that we use when we talk about human rights. And that, she said, really is more talking about, a better word would be person, because persons have certain psychological characteristics. They're sentient. They also can be moral agents. They can become rational. They can communicate. All of these things. So here's a little thought experiment. Some people hate thought experiments. Philosophers love them. I love them anyway. Think of the movie E.T., right? So he's an alien. This is fiction, but we can imagine it. would anyone say, well, is it okay to put him in a zoo? Or is it okay to eat him? And someone might say, sure, it's not human. Oh, wait a minute. He's got all of these right-making characteristics, moral status-making characteristics. Does it really matter what his genetic code is?
Yes.
The conservative might say, oh, okay, well, if we ever meet any aliens that are like ET, we'll probably have to allow them into the moral community, and maybe we'll have to allow even some animals here, chimps, gorillas, elephants. Now we know that octopuses, for example, really, really smart. Maybe they should get a higher moral status than other animals because of these psychological characteristics. But they might say, okay, so being human biologically isn't a necessary condition for having full moral status, but maybe it's a sufficient condition. That is, all humans should have equal moral status regardless of their psychological capacities. But I reject that. It's not that I don't think it's a rational argument. I just think there are reasons you can give not to accept the argument. So, for example, someone who has gone into a permanent vegetative state is still alive, still human, but do we think that they have the same moral status as a human being who can think and relate with people, etc.?
Right.
I don't think so. And so I think these psychological characteristics are more important to moral status than genetics alone. It's a problem for me because I have to say, well, what about someone who is severely mentally handicapped? We think we have to treat them in a different way than we might a member of another species who might have greater ability to think and act and do stuff. And my solution to that is not great, but I think it works, is to say, but the severely handicapped child, the severely disabled child is someone's child. And we have obligations to our children. And that's the basis for saying, no, you can't just say, oh, well, it can't think, so throw it out.
Right. Yeah, it does bring up a lot of difficult corner cases when you start thinking about it. And I've also, struggled with sentience versus sapience. Yes, you can feel pain, like sentience, you can feel pain, you have an experiential life, but sapience is another step up. You now have the ability to plan, you have an awareness of yourself as a being. You have there's all these scales,
I agree with you. And therefore, I don't think it's an on-off thing. I think that sentience is enough to get you on the moral status scale. Now we have to take consideration of your interests. We can't just say, oh, but, we want to use you in cockfights or we want to experiment on you. No, you've got to consider the interests of the being as well, which is not to say that I think all animal experimentation is wrong, but that's a different. But I think that on this moral status scale, those who have not only sentience but also sapience count for more, precisely because they have lives that they are aware of. They're aware of themselves as being existing through time. I think those things make us more important. And that's why I think that the Holocaust, for example, was a tragedy, whereas the killing of 6 million mice might be regrettable.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, that's very, very good. So in your mind, it's okay to have a sliding scale of moral, I don't know how you would term
Moral
it,
status.
basically moral status, yeah.
Yep. Different levels of moral status. I mean, it's not anything precise, but I do think that human persons, I should say more precisely, count for more. They have lives that are of greater value than the lives of, mice, for example.
So we also get the argument about, does the mother have an obligation to bring a fetus to term? Because this is something that I saw a very good argument for. If someone is dying and they need a kidney transplant, no one is obligated to give them their kidney to save them.
Right. Not even
Right?
your child, by the way, at least legally, although we talk about morally. Yes, you're right. There's two factors in the abortion argument. One is the moral status of the fetus, but equally important and often overlooked is the fact that fetuses are not floating around in the air. We don't even have them in artificial wombs. Some woman has to bear the fetus. And that means the question is not simply, does the fetus have moral status, but is the woman obligated to provide what is in essence life support? And Judith Jarvis Thompson, philosophy professor at MIT, now emeritus, many years ago came up with an example that I always loved to teach about the famous violinist. And she says, to see that there's a distinction between the right to life and the right to what you need to survive, she creates this example where there's this famous violinist who has a condition where his kidneys are failing and he needs to be hooked up to someone to have his kidneys perform. And the Society of Music Lovers kidnaps you because you are the only person in the world who has the right kind of kidneys, the right genetic code. And you wake up and you're in the hospital and you are connected to this famous violinist. Now, he clearly has a right to life. All violinists are persons and all persons have a right to life. So he has a right to life. Does he have a right to the use of your kidneys? The director of the hospital says, I'm terribly sorry. They really shouldn't have kidnapped you. That was wrong. But there's nothing I can do now because if we disconnect you, he'll die. But don't worry, it's only for 9 months. And after 9 months, you can get up and walk away. And she says, I suspect you would be outraged at this argument. And what's interesting about it, of course, people immediately start saying, yeah, he's a strange violinist. It's not like the relationship between the woman and her fetus. After all, if she does bring this fetus to term, she's its mother. Some people would say she's its mother now, right? So there's all kinds of things that can be said, but I think what makes it so interesting is making people understand that having a right to life does not necessarily give the fetus. Even if you just say, let's accept that it has a right to life. Let's grant that to the anti-abortion. It doesn't necessarily mean that the woman has an obligation. And here's an interesting twist, kind of an interesting historical twist in the history of the abortion literature. People who are anti-abortion but want to make an exception in the case of rape can use this argument. After all, the raped woman had nothing to do with her getting pregnant. It was not a voluntary action. She was the victim of an assault. And so they would say that in that case, you can't say that she has an obligation because of something she's done. She's now responsible for the existence of the fetus. And many people do want to make an exception in the case of rape. The other kind of exception people often want to make, those who are not the most extreme on abortion but more moderate, is where the abortion will either threaten the life of the woman. The Supreme Court just recently said, if her life's at stake, you can't prevent her from getting an abortion, or even serious health consequences. Once again, why? Because one might want to say that the fact that this is an attack on her life, or a threat to her life, I should say, a threat to her health, may make us want to say that she does not have an obligation, even though the fetus is, for the sake of argument, has a right to life.
That's very interesting. And I keep going back in my head to the fact that the arbitrariness, I guess, of the Catholic position on this seems out of character. Like, typically their papal statements are infallible papal statements are derived from their religious dogma. And I have never seen one derived from a scientific finding.
They're not
before.
all infallible, by the way. I don't even know what the rules are, but some are and some aren't. And this one wasn't. I think this was just trying to use modern genetic science to support the religious view. I mean, it definitely is a religious view. And a lot of Catholics don't even know that, for example, if it's a question between a situation in which the fetus can be saved, but the mother will die, you can't perform an abortion even in that situation, according to Catholic doctrine. You just have to let it go. So it's very, very rare, but the kind of example that one philosopher, Jonathan Bennett, used was where the fetus is stuck in the birth canal, and you can either let the woman die and then remove the fetus by, opening her pelvis, or you can crush the head of the fetus and save the life of the mother. And the argument is you can't kill one innocent person in order to save another innocent person. The fetus is not an attacker. It's not intending to do any harm to her, and therefore nothing can be done. And many Catholic doctors that's where they drew the line, Seriously? We have to let both of them die?
Wow. Yeah, that's and so it's not coming from the church. It's not coming from the fact that it's the genetic code. This is just a support of an existing position that is not necessarily well supported, I guess, from the text. Like the Bible is it a biblical thing that you shall not have an abortion?
No, I think it goes back to the Pauline saying of "Do not evil, that good may come," and so you cannot do something that is intrinsically wrong, which is to kill an innocent person, in order to bring about a good effect. Whereas utilitarianism says, why not? I mean, if that's the only way you can bring about the good effect, you want to have the least bad effect.
Right.
I don't think any of these are irrational. I mean, I think there are irrational views that you can show are either self-contradictory or something like that. I just think when people argue about it, you want to have your facts straight, and you want to try to be as consistent as possible and give as persuasive arguments as you possibly can.
And this, I guess, would come up as well. It has very similar moral status to the euthanasia arguments of the church, and how they basically the life is more important than anything. And
right.
I think that has caused a lot of problems. Like, and it's not been constant. This isn't like a universal code that we protect life over honor. Say, many civilizations in the past have valued dignity and honor over just life for the sake of life. So it's very interesting.
I don't know. I mean, I think the religious view is that only God should be able to decide when people live and when people die. Of course, we break that all the time with wars and capital punishment. Many of my Catholic students were amazed to find out that the Catholic Church actually rejects capital punishment because so many of them supported it and they had no idea. But again, it's very consistent. They do not accept putting people to death.
It's an interesting social statement that the abortion argument gets a lot more airplay than the capital punishment argument of the church.
It sure does. Right. And everybody knows what the church's view on abortion is. Most of them know what the church's view on contraception is. I have to tell you a little anecdote. My daughter-in-law is Catholic, and they have used IVF in order to have a child. And I said to her, Kathy, you're Catholic. You know what the church's view about IVF is. How do you square that? And she said, I just think Jesus would love this little face. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, this does bring up a lot of questions about genetic research and embryology and the status of even
Right.
non-implanted frozen embryos.
Right.
And it's really, quelling scientific development in that area, right?
Right. No, I'm completely on board with that. I think that um, IVF has been a blessing to many people. It's not without its dangers, of course, but it's been a blessing to many people. And research that helps them to have babies more easily and more safely, I'm all for it, And I don't think that embryos have interests of their own. So I don't have any problem with discard of embryos, using embryos in research. I mean, I just trying to equate an embryo, which is to me more similar to an ovum or a sperm, with a live born baby just seems hard to believe.
Yeah, I think some people get tripped up maybe with the potential
Yes.
of a life, right? The
Right.
fact that these embryos have the potential to become a human, or maybe they, maybe they get confused with souls. Maybe they think embryos have been allocated 1-to-1 a soul, and that soul won't get a right to life if it doesn't get.
Right.
I'm
Well, actually, there's
confused.
two things I want to say that. One is some people have said, look, when you talk about potentiality, you could talk about the fusion. And by the way, it's not a moment of conception; it takes place over 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a petri dish and you have an egg in there, and you could even put in just one sperm through a procedure called ICSI, where it gets injected into the egg.
Mm-hmm.
You've got those two, or you could have lots of sperm there. Don't you have a potential human being? Because in a few hours there will be fertilization. So is it a matter of those hours, or I guess it comes back to it doesn't have the genetic code. And again, your question of why put so much emphasis on having the genetic code. It
Mm.
seems, yeah,
It seems like an arbitrary choice that this is the
yeah,
basis of all morality, is this
right,
genetic code, and not
right,
sentience or sapience or
right,
having been
right,
brought into life.
right, right. I think what I also wanted to say is if you make the genetic code the end all and be all of moral status, then you would rule out any kind of uh, uh, rational aliens, Mr. Spock. You would say that it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter that gorillas have a consciousness and a kind of rationality, and octopuses have it. It doesn't matter because they're not human. And that does seem arbitrary. Why? If they have interests, if they have plans and projects and all kinds of things going on, if they can recognize others, those things seem to be at least as important morally as what the number of chromosomes in their cells.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good counter argument, I think, to that as a basis of morality, to say the least. It seems like post hoc apologetics, like a lot of things in that sphere. So, what do you think is the social basis behind this? Like, without this Catholic position, would there be any opposition to abortion? Are there
Oh,
other
I'm
groups
sure
that
there
are?
would be. I mean, um, you know, doctors have opposed abortion, for example, in the past. And I don't think it's solely religious. I think also opposition to abortion comes out of an older view of the role of women as mothers. And abortion seems to threaten that, as does contraception, the ability to plan when you're going to have children. So I think there's lots of things that go into views about abortion. there was a great book that was written many decades ago called Abortion and the Politics of Motherhood by Kristen Luker, and in which she talks about why certain people have the views they have. She's a sociologist. And it's really quite interesting. And why, for example, the what used to be called the rhythm method, I think they call it now natural family planning. It's not very effective. So the old joke is, what do you call people who use the rhythm method? Parents. They like that aspect because it doesn't give you complete control. You have to be willing. You have to be open to the possibility of conception. That's a particularly Catholic view, that in every act of intercourse, you are open to the possibility of conception, because basically that's the point. I mean, there's another point, of course, as well, and this is part of Catholic teaching, namely, it's the unity of the married couple, brings them together, makes them a unit, but it also leads to procreation. The Catholic view is you shouldn't be able to separate one from the other. If you use contraception, you're separating the possibility of procreation from the unity thing. But if you use IVF, you're separating the possibility of procreation from the unity, because it takes place in a lab. Right? And they think both of those are wrong. That's the basis of the Catholic objection to IVF. That, and of course, they're not crazy about the embryo discard either. But the real basis of it is the separation of these two things that they think should never be separated. So that means when old people have sex, they do. They are open to the possibility of conception, whatever that means.
Yes. Well, maybe the church doesn't like that either.
I don't think they've ever said that that's a no-go.
Okay.
But it is part of their objection to homosexuality. Or at least homosexual relations, to be very precise. They don't care if you're homosexual as long as you don't have homosexual relations.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's quite a rabbit hole we've gone down. I appreciate you coming on to the show and giving us the benefit of your expert perspective on this and clarifying some of these topics for us. So thank you so much, Bonnie, for talking with us today. I appreciate it.
It's been fun. Thank you, Al.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.